Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Jeff Loiter at NRRI. I'm going to wait just another minute or two for people to continue signing in, and then we will get started. Thanks. Okay, good afternoon. Again, this is Jeff Loiter at NRRI. Thanks for joining us for our webinar this month of December on ratepayer energy efficiency programs, where we have an excellent panel who will talk about the relevance of those programs and get a lot of perspectives about what the future may hold for them. Before I introduce our panelists, let me do a little advertising. Next month's webinar from NRRI will be on PURPA and discussion around the notice of proposed rulemaking that FERC issued in September. There have been a lot of comments submitted to FERC by that, and folks here at NRRI have been reviewing those comments, and I think there'll be a lively discussion about some of the important provisions in PURPA that are generating a lot of discussion. Also here at NARUC, the Center for Partnerships and Innovation, some of our friends downstairs, they have their innovation webinar series, and showing here on the screen are the next few webinars that they will be delivering on a variety of topics. So please go to their website and consider signing up for these if they are of interest to you. And last, just a little bit of basics. All of you are in listen-only mode. We won't be taking audio from the floor, but we encourage your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar control panel. You should be able to see a window similar to the image on your screen now. Go ahead, type your questions in. If you want to direct them to a particular panelist, you can. If it's just a general question, that's fine too. And we will work them into the conversation once we get through some of the initial statements. So with that, I will quickly introduce the panel, and then we'll go one at a time. Each of them will have a handful of minutes to sort of make an opening statement of sorts about their perspective on energy efficiency and some of the key issues with efficiency right now. So we have Maggie Molina from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. Sorry, I'm just noticing a typo there. It's Energy Efficient Economy, or ACEEE. We have Dian Grueneich, former commissioner from California and now pre-court energy scholar at Stanford. Ken Costello is a regulatory economist and independent consultant and former NRRI staffer. And Jennifer Easler, an attorney with the Department of Justice in Iowa in the Office of Consumer Advocate. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maggie. Maggie is Senior Director of Policy at ACEEE. She oversees federal, state, and local policy work, as well as utility regulation. She does energy efficiency program and policy research. Since joining ACEEE, she's authored numerous reports on state policy and utility sector efficiency programs, including some of the first editions of the well-known State Energy Efficiency Scorecard. She has a Master's of Engineering and Public Policy from the University of Maryland and a Bachelor of Arts degrees from Colgate University. Maggie, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to present today. I really look forward to a good discussion. Just in case you're not familiar with ACEEE, we're a nonprofit research organization that promotes efficiency for its economic benefits, environmental benefits, improved health outcomes, among others. I thought I'd start just by answering the question posed in the title of the webinar. I'd argue the relevance of efficiency in the utility sector is actually more compelling than ever. What we generally find is not that its relevance is questioned as a utility resource, but it's more of a question how best to design, scale, and target efficiency to really maximize its benefits for utility customers, the grid, and for public policy goals. So I thought I'd first just go over the premise for efficiency as a utility resource, a bit of information on its size and costs and benefits, and then I'd like to mention a few policy trends that we're seeing in our research relevant to the future of energy efficiency in the utility sector. So historically, efficiency in the utility sector came about as a supply side alternative and as a lower cost option compared to investments in generation or transmission and distribution. And because customers face persistent market barriers such as information barriers, upfront costs, split incentives, program interventions are then needed to ensure customers invest in energy savings projects. And because traditionally utilities make money by selling energy rather than saving energy, that's why regulatory barriers need to be addressed as well through policy changes. We have a lot of literature that supports the persistence of those barriers. In a paper my colleague Marty Kuchler wrote last year, some great references on those. So today, efficiency remains on average the lowest cost resource. We've done a lot of research on this, as has Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. For example, a paper I did published last year, I found on average programs cost about 3.1 cents per kilowatt hour. So on a cost basis, efficiency is certainly a critical resource for utility planners. Investments in the sector have grown more than sixfold since the mid-90s. I went back and checked our numbers since we've been tracking this for some time. So in 2018, investments in efficiency were about $8 billion. So those are program investments. 6.6 of that in electricity programs, 1.4 in natural gas programs. So these are really large investments, and they also leverage customer side investments as well and private capital as well, and they've had significant impact on savings for customers. We've been tracking that and found a total of 270 terawatt hours in 2018. So if you add up all the efficiency in the utility sector we've done since the 90s. So that's equivalent to 7% of total sales nationwide. And that success has been due to addressing those regulatory and market failures. Most importantly, for utility policies, setting mandatory efficiency targets for utilities and aligning business models with efficiency performance outcomes. So we see a compelling need for efficiency on a cost basis, but that's of course only part of the story. Efficiency delivers a number of other benefits, not just to the utility system, but to all customers in that system and towards broader public policy goals. And it's really important for a state's approach to cost benefit analysis fully captures those values, and that the benchmark that efficiency is measured against, or the avoided energy costs typically, that those really characterize and fully characterize the benefit, the value stack of efficiency. The National Standard Practice Manual is a great resource for states if you're looking to either design or perhaps fine-tune existing efficiency cost benefit policies. So I mentioned a few policy trends that we've tracked and found in our research in the last year or so. One is an increased interest and need to better value the carbon reductions from energy efficiency and what this means for efficiency rules and regulations. Over the summer, we published a paper on next generation energy efficiency resource standards, or EERS, similar to RPS on the EE side. These set clear long-term energy savings targets for utilities or other implementers. So in that research, we looked at several states and how are their ERS policies changing. And we found that for those states we looked at, they have an increased focus on emissions reductions, recognizing that efficiency is critical to supporting climate policies such as greenhouse gas reduction targets. And while those policies have traditionally been designed with annual targets expressed in kilowatt hours or therms of natural gas, some states with an increased focus on GHG, they're also establishing fuel neutral goals expressed in BTUs, and then using sub-targets for electricity and natural gas savings. So this allows for savings in buildings beyond those fuels, such as fuel oil and propane, to be counted towards goals. It also encourages beneficial electrification strategies. In that research, we found that frameworks with multiple goals, so especially where they include, as I said, fuel neutral and resource specific sub-targets, we find those are the best toolkit to meet long-term climate and clean energy objectives. And then one other thing more broadly on efficiency as a climate solution, I should mention another recent paper we did showing how an ambitious set of efficiency strategies, broader than just utility sector, but much more comprehensive, can get us halfway towards long-term 2050 climate targets. But in the utility sector, those policies are really important as well. So a second emerging area that we've seen is with an increased penetration of renewables, there's an increased opportunity to optimize the time value of efficiency and better integrate it with other distributed resources such as demand response. So for example, and this doesn't apply everywhere, but in those places with a higher penetration of solar, which of course varies by time of day and season, and that leads to ramping needs, grid planners can use efficiency as a demand-side solution. So in those situations, of course, efficiency will need to deliver in the times and locations it's providing the most grid value, and that's an important complement to broader base efficiency. But it does offer flexibility to meet demand at those critical times, but we'll need good data on that. And I know LBNL has some new research out on the time value of energy efficiency, which is a great resource. Similarly, efficiency to meet this demand flexibility need, efficiency can also be better integrated with other resources like demand response. We've also been looking at this in our research. We found some integrated programs in a recent paper we did, but we also found utilities were facing a lot of challenges in better integrating those resources. And then a third area I wanted to mention and then just wrap up is the growing focus on equity considerations and really compelling need for more investments in efficiency to alleviate household energy burdens for those most in need. We've done research on household energy burdens, which is the percentage of household income that goes to pay energy bills, and found those are significantly higher for low-income households. And of course, efficiency is an important solution to help alleviate those energy burdens by reducing bills. But ensuring that the benefits of efficiency lead to that policy need requires a clear focus on program design and policy design as well. The next generation ERS research that I mentioned, we also found in those states we profiled an increased focus on equity considerations, which is a great sign, but it's not yet universal across the country. So there's some tools states can consider if they don't already have them. For example, specific targets for low-income programs, ensuring that cost-effectiveness tests capture the multiple benefits of low-income programs. And we have a number of resources for regulators and their staff on these topics. So with that, I'll just wrap up. We find efficiency remains a low-cost resource, critical strategy to meet carbon reduction goals, and an important resource to help alleviate household energy burdens. Good analysis is really important. Putting resources into high-quality resource planning, efficiency potential studies, and aligning those with efficiency policy drivers will be really important. Again, we have a lot of resources on this, and we can provide technical assistance to regulators and their staff and other stakeholders, and would be happy to serve as a resource to you if that would be helpful. With that, Jeff, I will turn it back to you and look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks very much, Maggie. Thanks for that great overview of some of the important current issues, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of those and talk about them in a little more detail. I want to just note for the audience, those of you who are wondering if there's more to be seen on your screen than the list of panelists, the answer right now is no. We're not doing this sort of as presentations with slides. We really are going to try to focus on the discussion here. So you are not missing something. Your screen has not frozen. So now I'd like to introduce the Honorable Dian Grueneich, who is Precourt Energy Scholar at Stanford University's Precourt Institute for Energy. She was a commissioner in the California Public Utilities Commission. At Stanford, she is co-instructing a new online course on building energy efficiency, technology, policy, and finance. And that's available online at bee.stanford.edu. Honorable Commissioner Grueneich is an internationally recognized energy expert. She's worked on energy policy for over 4 decades and has received numerous awards for her work on efficiency, including the 30th Anniversary Award from ACEEE for outstanding contributions, and also ACEEE's National Champion of Energy Efficiency Award. She is serves on the external advisory committees for U.S. Department of Energy and the National Renewable Energy Lab. She has received a NRRI Clean Energy Award and has been named, given a Visionary Award for leadership in developing California's long-term energy efficiency strategic plan. So, Commissioner Grueneich, please say hello and let us know what's on your mind.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm delighted to be on this. Never bored talking about energy efficiency. So like with Maggie, I'll go to the heart of the question posed here. Are ratepayer funded energy efficiency programs still relevant? I started back in this area in the late 1970s. So I'm in my 4th decade. And I think this question gets asked at least every 5 years. Are these still relevant? And the answer is yes. It is true that energy efficiency is our lowest cost resource. You can save money doing it, but every study that we know shows that we have an enormous amount of inefficiency in our systems. And my focus for the last few years has been on buildings as opposed to transportation. And here in the United States, most of our building stock is built, though we certainly are building new buildings, but most of our buildings remain very inefficient, which means that the people who own those buildings or who live in those buildings are spending more every month on electric, natural gas, propane bills than they need to spend. And as Maggie said, we developed this whole science of energy efficiency many years ago when some really bright people thought about it, including Art Rosenfeld, and put it together that it's not just the buildings, but those buildings are using electricity and natural gas. And if you can collectively reduce the use of fuels in those buildings, you can then, going down the system, avoid building more expensive power plants or transmission lines. So efficiency is this odd creature in my mind that it developed at looking at it over the system-wide savings. And for commissioners, staffs, regulators, that's super important because that means overall your rates can go down if you're not building more expensive supply side. But the way it's accomplished is by looking at who's using energy within those buildings. And that's where it gets so tricky that I often describe energy efficiency as it's like ice cream. There's dozens and dozens of different flavors of it. How it is served up varies dramatically depending upon the circumstances. So that's one of the great values of efficiency, is that you can do it in lots of different ways, but it also makes it very complex. And for those of you who may be new to this area, even sort of understanding these complex rules, cost effectiveness, our barriers, our motivations, potential studies, that can be daunting. So, but I wanted to say what Maggie emphasized, This is not something new. We know a lot about it. We've improved a lot of our methods. So when I had the good fortune to come to Stanford, one of the things that I started thinking about was, how could you explain and think about energy efficiency in a more integrated fashion? And out of that arose this new course that was just mentioned, that we have received endorsement from NRRI, and there'll be more promotion going out the first of the year, though it is available now. But we try to teach the fundamentals of energy efficiency. When you design an energy efficiency program, especially one that's using ratepayer money, you have, in my mind, a fiduciary duty to make sure that money is well spent. And so that's where we're increasingly sophisticated about thinking about what audiences are we targeting. Programs and efforts that are going to low-income customers are dramatically different from what you might be going if you're a residential or an industrial customer. But equally important, you want to think about, are you trying to do something called market transformation, which I personally think is tremendously important. That again, in our course, we do many case studies on technology to understand the types of technology that has come into the area of efficiency. But then what are the different types of policy tools depending upon the technology, and how do you think about the finance? And so for market transformation, if any of your states are looking at this to be involved with your utilities, you usually want to think about it in terms of a multi-year effort. You don't transform a market, saying going from incandescent to LED light bulbs in 1 year. You're really trying to get products out to the market. You're trying to look at your upstream delivers of those technologies. You're trying to do some educational programs. And so it's sort of like, I'll use the analogy of, you're making your ice cream sundae. You're not just using one flavor of ice cream or one technique with efficiency. You're mixing them all together. And because this is, again, ratepayer money, where I said fiduciary duty, you really want to think about the measurement and verification, because unlike solar panels, which you can just go out and say, are they, on the roofs or not, with efficiency, it's more invisible and it's more of what's not occurring. So you have a lot of techniques that we've developed over the years for measurement and verification. In my mind, it's tremendously important that you're not just as regulators relying upon results that the utilities themselves report. If they're also administering the program, you want to have some independent third-party verification. And you want to use that information to really change programs as needs evolve. So I'll just end with sort of, I think, two thoughts. One is we still have a lot of work to do with just our classic type of energy efficiency, whether the technologies are light bulbs or insulation or water heaters. There's a lot that we can do to get our more efficient appliances and technologies into our buildings and being used. And that's a role for commissioners, for the utilities, for advocates, et cetera. But then another area, and this again is something we've been studying at Stanford, is the new frontiers. And it's super exciting that we have more going on in terms of where efficiency is going to go now than we have in 40 years. We have digitalization and intelligent efficiency, and that's making all the difference of understanding what's going on in our buildings, knowing how to target where we're going to put that efficiency, and making efficiency what I call a good neighbor in our changing grid that Maggie mentioned, that we now can think about locational and time value of efficiency. But then there's also building decarbonization, thinking on the term about what's efficiency's goal in climate change goals. So I'll just finish with, I think it's a collection of both the fundamentals, we've got to keep going on it and constantly improve how we're doing it, but then also think about what policies do we need to change and to develop so that as utility commissions and utilities, there is a role for pushing ahead into the new frontiers. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Diane. Very much appreciate your comments. I will pause briefly to remind listeners that if you do have specific questions or general questions that you've already thought of, feel free to submit them now so that you don't forget them. We will hold them and come back to them as appropriate. But don't wait. Let us see what's on your mind and what you'd like to hear more about. Next, we've got Ken Costello. Ken's a regulatory economist and independent consultant. He previously did work for NRRI, as well as the Illinois Commerce Commission, Argonne National Laboratory, and Commonwealth Edison. He has conducted extensive research and written on a wide variety of topics related to energy industries and public utility regulation. His research has appeared in books, reports, and many journals and publications, including Public Utilities Fortnightly, Cato Journal, the Electricity Journal, of which he also serves on the editorial advisory board, Energy Journal, Energy Law Journal, and the Ural Journal on Regulation, among several others. He has provided training and consulting services throughout the Americas, as well as Central and Eastern Europe and Asia. He received the 2017 Crystal Award for Distinguished Contribution to Public Utility Regulatory Policy, which is sponsored by the Financial Research Institute at the University of Missouri, Columbia. Ken has a BS and an MA from Marquette University, and I think Ken will provide some different perspectives and some new topics for us to think about. Ken, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. My focus is really on how to improve energy efficiency from the perspective of commissions. And I think the major concern of commissions is consumer, welfare, but they also have other concerns. So the primary questions seem to be, what are the rationales for utility energy efficiency programs and how valid they are today? Second question is, how can we get more benefits from these programs, given the costs that are incurred by utility ratepayers or customers? And number three, I guess the main question today, to think about, should we scale up or scale down utility programs, energy efficiency programs? And if so, how do we do that? I think at the minimum, regulators need access to objective, unbiased information and making good decisions. That's true in every aspect of regulation. It's true here as well. And my comments will derive from a combination of economics. I'm an economist, from empirical evidence I've seen from utility studies as well as academic studies, and my personal observations. And I started working on energy efficiency when I was a staff member of the Illinois Commerce Commission around 1985, so that gives away my age. Some of my observations, the main sort of rationale for these programs is sort of that there's some sort of market problems, behavioral problems by consumers, specifically that they don't invest enough, spend enough time and money on energy efficiency. And I think sort of the implication is that if you're going to get the most out of these programs, they should be targeted at specific market problems. For example, if the problem is low income people not investing in energy efficiency because of their deficient income, then directing informational programs and giving them small rebates, isn't going to get a good response. One thing I've observed over the years, different rationale for energy efficiency programs. I know when I worked at the Illinois Commission years ago, the rationale was that energy efficiency could reduce oil imports, could economize on scarce energy resources such as natural gas, and avoid the building of large new generating facilities which were susceptible to high costs, overruns, and environmental problems. But since sort of raised the question, since we're moving to clean energy for electric generation, natural gas resources are abundant for a number of years now, and they expect to be in the future. And oil imports are less of a problem than they were in the past. The emphasis seems to be on promoting energy efficiency to mitigate climate change. And sort of the question for the panel, which hopefully we'll discuss later, does this seem to be correct? Another observation is that, as I mentioned, that do we know what types of programs have been most successful in addressing specific market and behavioral problems? And as an economist, you sort of advocate the position that the best public policies improve market performance. Those that do are those individually tailored to specific market failures or problems. And in more recent times, economics has evolved where not only should be concerned with market problems, but behavioral failures by customers, and perhaps we could talk more about that later. Pricing, I think we cannot forget pricing in inducing more energy efficiency, especially during peak periods for electric consumption. Prices for, as we know, for many utilities are far below marginal costs or real-time costs. Also, the fact that utility prices do not reflect the societal cost of carbon emissions, more energy efficiency would result from inclusion of those costs. So basically, the question is, these programs, maybe have been effective, but it just seems like we should put more emphasis on better pricing to promote energy efficiency and give consumers proper price signals. I think there's also a problem of distinguishing between market barriers and market failures. The fact that there's consumers out there hesitant to invest in energy efficiency might be a rational response on their part. They may say that, they may think that the benefits are too uncertain, if they invest a large amount of money. And there may be other reasons too. Consumers differ. Some consumers don't consume much electricity or natural gas and wouldn't pay for them, or maybe to invest, spend more on high efficient appliances. And there's other reasons as well. And sort of the question is, even though we observe, technically that, there's a lot of potential for more energy efficiency, it may not be rational, may not be economical for customers to pursue those alternatives. One thing I've noticed too is what's called nudging, which is sort of a term used in behavioral economics, is that it could be a cost-effective way to encourage energy efficiency that perhaps should be given more prominence. One example is there's some evidence that if utilities submit bills that also have the energy consumption of neighbors and others, peer groups, that could have a significant effect on people's behavior towards conserving more. Another issue is probably half the states or more have targets on energy savings, and they consider it as good public policy. But the question I have, how should the target be established? How do we know that the target won't result in programs that are not cost effective? And do policymakers really have the information they need to know what an optimal target is? Issue, sort of, as I discussed before, I think there should be more target in reducing peak demand, because in those periods, the cost of producing electricity is the highest. So that's where like time of day or real-time pricing could have a significant effect on reducing people's consumption near high cost periods. The question, sort of the last, or a couple points, one last, or next to the last point is to concern about measuring the cost and energy savings from these programs. Are they biased and accurate? It was mentioned that it's important to have independent review of these costs. It's not just the utilities reporting these, the savings and the cost to the regulators, because they may have an incentive to overinflate the savings. Another concern I have is when you look at peer review academic studies, they consistently point to lower energy savings from utility programs than what's expected from engineering or simulation studies. So much of the empirical evidence from these studies, which they use state-of-the-art, the best techniques, their evidence run counter to conventional wisdom among policymakers and practitioners about energy efficiency programs. So I think an important question is, well, first of all, who do we believe more? And number two is why there's such a difference between utility studies and academic studies. And finally, the three major challenges for regulators, I think one is to provide utilities with the right incentives to spend their money wisely. And this gets into rate-making issues. Number two is that energy efficiency is one goal. That may be an important goal for a regulator, but there could be instances where in promoting energy efficiency, that could conflict with other regulatory objectives. For example, that could increase rates in the short term. It could produce inequality in the sense that, and this has been raised by some industrial customers that they're paying for these programs, but they're not benefiting from them because they have their own reasons for promote energy efficiency, and why should their rates go up to pay for other people's programs? And devoid of like decoupling and other sort of innovative rate-making mechanisms, energy efficiency could worsen the financial condition of utilities. And finally, this third challenge, as was mentioned, is to monitor the utilities for evaluating, measuring, and verifying energy savings from their programs. And this can help regulators ensure that the energy efficiency programs are meeting their targets, that ratepayer funds are being spent prudently, and that energy efficiency programs are cost effective. So with that, Jeff, I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Ken. Lots of good topics there that I'm sure people will want to return to. Our fourth panelist, last but certainly not least, is Jennifer Easler. She is joining us from the Iowa Department of Justice, Office of Consumer Advocate, where she's an attorney representing consumers and the public interest in regulated utility matters. Her work has included ratepayer-funded energy efficiency plans administered by utilities in that state, renewable energy projects, and smart grid plan collaboration. She also represents the public consumer sector in transmission matters at Mid-Continent ISO and FERC. She co-chairs the Electric Committee for the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, which is affectionately referred to as NASUCA. She has served on the US DOE and EPA State Energy Efficiency Action Network, sometimes referred to as C-Action, on the executive committee there, and she is a recipient of the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance's Leadership Award. Jennifer has a Bachelor's of Business Administration and Finance from the University of Iowa and her Juris Doctorate from Drake University. Jennifer, please let us know what you're thinking about today in terms of energy efficiency.
Well, thank you for having me. As a state consumer advocate, we, in my perspective in particular, as to the question posed, is that ratepayer-funded energy efficiency does continue to be relevant because cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities remain. These opportunities are a significant factor in the demand consumption projections that our utilities plan to meet, and therefore impact the utility obligations that we see in their generation planning and in the rate case proceedings that come in front of our utilities commission. The state of Iowa in particular has been part of an evolving regulatory policy construct, and we've been doing energy efficiency as a policy requirement since the 1990s, starting initially with a minimum spend and deferred cost recovery of energy efficiency spending, moving to contemporaneous cost recovery and no minimum spending in the 90s and up until about 2018. And that the contemporaneous cost recovery served to encourage greatly expanded investment in cost-effective energy efficiency. And then in 2018, the policy now calls for maximum spending of 2% for electric revenues and 1.5% for natural gas utility revenues. And then program budgets are subject to an opt-out trigger should the portfolios fall below a 1.0 ratepayer impact benefit cost test. So our policy directives have changed over the years, but I think regardless of the situation that we have found it beneficial, and what we try to do is to make sure that the energy efficiency programs are benefiting all customers to the greatest extent possible. And some of the steps that we take to assure that is to develop a reliable savings assumptions that go into the energy efficiency plans. We undertook a technical reference manual about 5 years ago, and that has helped get everybody on the same page in terms of what they believe to be appropriate cost and savings assumptions for particular technologies. A second area and way to make sure that customers are benefiting is to have accurate avoided cost calculations that flow into your benefit cost analysis. And so if you do that, by definition, energy efficiency should be part of a good least cost planning effort, and that supports why we think it is still a relevant thing to do for ratepayers. And then another area that we focus considerable effort on is making sure that the programs are prudently implemented, and that they're supported by rigorous monitoring and verification, ideally by an independent party, to make sure, again, that the assumptions underlying your program are proven and that the savings are occurring and benefiting customers like you expect them to do. We then, as part of the prudent administration, we want to make sure, to Ken's point, we want to make sure we're addressing the real barriers to customer adoption of energy efficiency, and that often is awareness of the technology and the ability to implement it, and secondly, the upfront cost. So targeting our programs to address those particular barriers is part of how we make sure the programs are being responsive to customers. So ultimately, we want to make sure that customers save money as a result of the programs, and we think those are the key components going into making sure that does occur. And with that, I'd be glad to address questions.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. So if I could, I'll just quickly maybe summarize some of the major points and topics that I've heard our panelists raise, and then I'd like to sort of maybe return to the top of the list briefly, so the folks who spoke earlier can maybe respond to some of the things they've heard, and then we can continue on and look at some of these issues in a little more detail. So among the major themes that I heard from the panelists, the importance of accurate evaluation, the consideration of equity, the importance of addressing the key barriers or failures that are at work, and making sure the programs are well targeted to solve the problems that are in evidence in any particular market. the various economic perspectives have been touched on a little bit, and the issue of cost effectiveness and the need to have an accurate assessment of that. And that touches on both what are the, the avoided costs on the generation side, and these days getting at a more sophisticated understanding of that with regard to temporal and spatial variations. As Ken mentioned, for example, the issue of peak savings versus sort of generic energy savings. A couple of things that I also sort of thought of during the conversation that I'll put out there for the panelists to potentially pick up on. Our audience, which comes from a very wide range of states and jurisdictions across the country, some of the audience may be in states where there are still vertically integrated utilities, and some may be in states where the utility is deregulated. And as Jennifer mentioned, issues of planning, different regulators are going to have a different perspective on energy efficiency as it relates to utility resource planning and resource adequacy. So that may speak to factors that you, the audience, the regulators, and staff may want to consider as you think about how energy efficiency fits into your world. And last, also, I think it was sort of touched on or hinted at, but in many instances, energy efficiency has been determined to be a policy goal by the legislature, for example, and it's something that the regulator has some bounds around that they have to work within. So all of those, I think, are very relevant topics, and we certainly won't have enough time to dig deeply into all of them. But I want to, turn it back to Maggie first. Maggie, what did you hear your co-panelists say after you that you want to amplify or offer a different perspective on or extend?
Sure, thank you. There are so many things. I will jump into a couple maybe from your summary, just in the interest of time. I thought maybe prioritizing things, at least from my perspective, a couple of mentions of the importance of evaluation and an independent review process. I think that's really critical, and that is a best practice to have independence in EM&V and have a good framework behind that. We've done surveys in the past of how many states require independence in their review or their EM&V process. And last time we did one back in 2012, we found the vast majority of states did require independent EM&V. We're actually updating that research in 2020 on that, not just looking at independence, of course, but looking at a number of factors on EM&V, because it's really important to evolve EM&V, take advantage of new data tools, new access to energy usage data, to really sharpen program strategy. So this goes into another summary point you made, Jeff, that both Diane, I think Ken, we're both getting to, and that's at targeting programs to where they're needed most. And that is essentially what process evaluation is there to do, ensure it's a good process, and then also impact evaluation that's getting the impacts it needs. But targeting programs to where the market failures are is really critical. And I think, for example, the split incentive problem. Traditionally, the multifamily sector is a big area where that's a persistent market failure, among other many broader market barriers. As Ken said, there's a distinction between the two. But the multifamily sector was underserved for a number of years. We've seen a lot of progress just in the last 5 years or so, and a number of resources going in to meet the needs of the multifamily housing sector. So that's one program area. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening with, as I mentioned, access to new data and new tools, a lot of exciting opportunities, as Diane mentioned, to better target programs to where they're needed most. I think that could be a session, a webinar in of itself. The informational barrier. I think we heard a couple of ideas on how to raise consumer awareness, market awareness, gain market insights, and think of new tools to address the access to information barriers. How can we leverage better web-based tools, web-based interfaces, smartphone-based tools? There's a number of things. I could go on and on this, but I will wrap with just a couple of thoughts there. And I guess we can keep going on some of these other topics I didn't address, but I wanted to first hit on the importance of independence of evaluation, and yes, to evolving program strategies to address market barriers.
Thanks, Maggie. Diane, I wonder if you could, from among these areas of inquiry that we've been talking about, putting back on your regulator hat, are there strategies or approaches to some of these issues, and you could pick any one that's near and dear to your heart. Are there strategies that you think regulators can use to help them make the decisions that they need to make in their jurisdiction regarding energy efficiency? If a utility comes forward and wants to deliver an energy efficiency program, or if they're required to, or if they have different kinds of proposals for cost recovery, what are the resources or sort of the strategies that you think regulators have available to them now, again, to any or all of these important issues?
Here's one thing I might suggest, which is that commissions, perhaps with your consumer advocate, with your governor's office, depending upon, what the political flavor of the day is there, but hold an innovation technology workshop and invite in companies to talk about energy efficiency technologies and how they might be implemented in your state. Encourage them to educate the commissions and the staff, as well as utilities. What are the barriers? Because what I've found over the years is that we have a host of policy rules in the energy efficiency world, appropriately so, but they were designed around a specific type of technology. Used to be insulation. And so it was something that you were looking at engineering calculations, you were looking at rebates, etc. Well, when I was a commissioner, O-Power, the company that does behavioral reports, suddenly emerged, and I realized we didn't have a policy rule in California that allowed any counting of savings from behavioral-based programs. And we had to change our rules. So I think one important thing you might think of, that's not a lot of money, and I'm sure LB&L or other national labs or even DOE could help organize, is just a day to have the companies themselves come in and talk about where is technology going, what are some new finance tools. The other thing that I'm just going to throw out there is that we are so concerned in this area of cost effectiveness, which I get why we do it. But when we're talking, for example, about subsidies for batteries or for solar PV, it's usually not in the context of cost effectiveness. It's in the context of how can we have some competitive procurement to keep costs lower. But we say we know this is going to be an additional cost because we want to bring the market forces into play to really develop our markets, and in the longer run, lower battery costs or lower PV costs. And I fear that we just don't think enough about doing that on the efficiency side, that we say it's what we love the most, but it's the most stringent test to pass through. Now, I'm not saying we get away from it entirely, but I think another useful thing to think about is within each of your own states or maybe regional areas, what are some of the technologies that you think are promising that you'd like to bring in? And can you develop a 5-year market transformation plan that really brings to bear a lot of market forces, but also makes judicious use of utility money. And there's lots of examples of how it can be done. But those are my two thoughts, to think, how do you learn about new technologies and learn about what policy changes are needed? And then secondly, can you start thinking about a couple of areas of market transformation? Maggie mentioned one on multifamily. There's certainly some with low income that are very interesting and important to do. And then can you develop maybe a 5-year plan of both spending of money, but bringing in companies and bringing in the private sector finance as well? That's what comes to mind.
Thanks, Diane. I think there's a great segue from what you just said there about the market transformation and new technologies a little bit, to address a question that we've received from the audience, which, if I can try to paraphrase it, asks the question: if there are economic benefits and economic value to these investments in energy efficiency, why if in an area where it would be allowed or feasible, such as a deregulated jurisdiction, why isn't the market, why aren't there businesses that are able to capture those economic benefits as a business by finding those economically beneficial investments? So I'll start by asking, Ken, because Ken, I think that gets at some of your perspective on, the appropriate use of sort of an intervention in a market. What do you see happening or not happening with that, and how does that relate to the larger issue?
Yeah, Jeff. I mean, we do see a private sector, right? Non-utility sector trying to sell, energy efficiency. And that probably would be more robust if the utilities weren't so involved in subsidizing some of the services and that with customers, like audits. I suspect it would be a more vibrant market for audits by consumers if the utilities didn't get involved with that. It's a good question. And we do see, like houses, new houses being built with, which are much more energy efficient. And so I think where we come around to maybe evolve over the years is initially that wasn't done much because builders and consumers would value it that much. So why spend extra money if they're going to charge customers more for a house, to install, to have the house more energy efficient? Customers wouldn't really, wouldn't be willing to pay for that. But I think that has changed a lot, certainly, over the years. So I do see the private sector, and I don't know what the revenues are or the magnitude of their business.
It's mainly building standards.
I'm sorry?
It's mainly building standards that are changing our new housing market. Mandates.
Right. The split incentive problem is an issue for new construction as well. There's the builder and there's the consumer. So that's another case where policy intervention is needed because of that market failure of the split incentive. And I think more broadly, I mean, the question is assuming that the economic driver is enough for the private sector to step in, and where the economics are highly favorable. So ESCO, for example, have served, but mainly the public sector, the so-called MUSH market, municipal, university, schools, and hospitals. So we have seen, I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I think several $1 billion of investments through ESCOs. But again, large buildings, typically where the economics are more favorable. But the question should go back, though, those aren't happening, those investments aren't happening because of the persistent market failures and the places where the private sector is stepping in, and there is an opportunity is in the extremely low cost places, but there are other reasons, businesses, even for extremely low payback period investments, energy bills just often aren't a priority compared to other opportunities for capital investment. So
but is that a market failure, or is that just, a company has so much money to spend on capital investments, they feel they could get a higher return on other uses of that money rather than energy efficiency?
I would encourage us to think of it. It is a failure to take advantage of really making our economy as productive and efficient as possible. And probably because you're an economist, you're looking at this from a little bit different perspective. I'm an out and out advocate on climate change. I recognize not everybody who's certainly listening into this webinar is going to come to that with the same perspective. But without getting political, climate change is real, and we have very few years to reduce our emissions. And every single study that we know of shows that making our buildings much, much more efficient, not just the new ones, but the existing ones, is a critical part of that. So I think none of us are saying utility customers are the only ones on the hook to make this happen. But at the same time, they can be a very significant player in this whole effort. And so where we see year after year failure of getting our buildings efficient to occur, those are failures, and we all want to think about how can we overcome that. And there's lots of different ways to do it, but we have inefficient buildings, and that's something we want to change as quickly as possible.
Well,
so yeah, Ken, I want to kick it back to you. I mean, Ken, is a key market failure the fact that the economic incentives for either the owner or the potential energy service company is the failure in that there are externalities to the cost effectiveness issue from a sort of a total economic or societal perspective? Is that a key failure that's creating this disconnect, you think, or is it something else?
No, I think that's an important element. Is that when we consume energy, there's an external cost, okay, and that's not reflected to the extent it's not reflected in the price of the energy. Then there is then there is. I mean, if everything else is the same, then you could you can argue that there's overconsumption of energy, right? And that's why some people are advocating like a carbon tax, which would be a way in which then the decision makers, the firms, the consumers, and others will be able to respond to that tax and making what they consider optimal decisions. So I think that's to me that's that's a source of market failure, right? With the carbon, with the greenhouse gases being emitted, and the consumers aren't responsible for that. The other market failures like lack of information, or customers are myopic. They look at the initial costs and they say, even though if the present value benefits are greater, they're still not going to do it. I think to some extent they're exaggerated, certainly, and there's other reasons, like I mentioned before, why customers aren't engaged as much in energy efficiency as you think they would, or they should. The uncertainty, I think it's, the uncertainty of the future benefits. I know if I, conserve or spend money on insulation or something, or think about it, I question the benefits over time. That's just a high uncertainty, and that gets reflected in a high discount rate, because studies have shown that implicitly customers have a high discount rate, which could be explained at least partially by the high uncertainty over the future benefits. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be something we might want to return to in terms of what are strategies for managing that uncertainty going forward. I want to make sure we tackle some of the other customer questions that are coming in. So we have a question asking about with the change in technologies, with the change in the the baseline level of energy efficiency that exists, and with currently low prices for energy, again, leaving aside externalities, in some jurisdictions, the cost effectiveness calculus has changed. What's happening in different jurisdictions as a result of that, and are there solutions to that better align the policy of a state or jurisdiction with respect to energy and some of these calculus? I think Maggie, you can probably speak to this a little bit with the NSPM. Maybe that's a good time to introduce this.
Sure, and I mentioned the NSPM earlier in my remarks as a good tool for states to align their efficiency cost-benefit policies with a broader set of policies in the state. There's also a new NSPM in development right now specific to distributed energy resources, and that should be available mid-2020. So that will be another resource beyond just NSPM for efficiency, but a broader set of resources. And
Maggie, I'm sorry, can you just sort of very, 1 minute, give the explanation for what the NSPM is for audience members who might not be familiar with that?
Sure. So instead of the California Standard Practice Manual, it had been around for some time, and it had been an important resource to other states, which took a fairly prescriptive approach to how to establish those cost-benefit tests. The idea of the NSPM is to not be prescriptive in a formula or approach, but to provide a framework for a state to walk through the policies, the policy drivers for them, whether that's carbon, equity, jobs, resilience, risk, low costs, align all of those policy drivers with an appropriate cost benefit test for their state. So there are resources available to regulators if you're interested in exploring that. And as I mentioned, the DER, NSPM should be available mid-2020. But yeah, back to kind of what you started with the participant question about the change in programs. Of course, with new codes and standards, that does increase or decrease baseline for those measures. And of course, some measures won't pencil out, but that's to be expected, I would say, in a market transformation approach. So some of that low-hanging fruit does no longer pencil out for a utility resource standpoint, and the market has taken over. Residential LED bulbs are a good example of that. And that's where I think a lot of exciting new technology innovation, program strategies, and underserved segments that are historically underserved, but now with some new strategies like multifamily, those segments can be served. And then leveraging financing strategies. So there's a number of things that I think are available, and there's resources. AESP is a great venue to really dig into some of those program strategies.
Thanks, Maggie. I appreciate the perspective, and I would echo that the National Standard Practice Manual is a really valuable research, and I would encourage regulators to look into that. There are, I know of at least 2 states that have really used it to create a new test, a new cost effectiveness test that does reflect their state policy benefits, and that's Rhode Island, and I believe Connecticut recently did that as well. But I want to take a different tack here for just a second and talk about some other issues that I think are relevant to regulators that have been touched on a couple times, and that has to do with not how how efficiency programs are incentivizing customer behavior, but how regulators can or should incentivize utility behavior. If we start from a position of having a utility delivered efficiency program, what are some of the key factors that regulators need to consider in how that cost recovery is done? And Jennifer, you did touch on this a little bit in some of your earlier statements, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that particular aspect and how you see, from the consumer advocate perspective, how should a utility be rewarded for doing efficiency programs, and what are the incentives that they should be subject to? Should it all be carrot and no stick? Should there be penalties? How does that work for you and your perspective?
Well, in Iowa, we don't have a reward system, and I think when we're talking about energy efficiency, a reward or payment type approach for savings tends to invite high levels of controversy about what was actually saved, what would have occurred but for the programs. It might encourage going after the low-hanging fruit, going after measures that don't deliver deep and long-term savings. So we, I think, have wisely not rewarded utilities in that manner. Rather, our regulators have the ability to consider how well the utilities are doing in implementing the programs through the return on equity decision that a utility gets in a regulated rate case. And as well, we do have also, in addition to that carrot, we have a stick approach where if the utility is not taking appropriate steps to implement the programs, that there is a possibility that they would not recover some of their costs. So I think that happens to be a good approach, especially in a state where we are looking at spending caps and having to make fewer budgeted dollars go farther than they have in the past. So we're looking at opportunities to keep things as lean and as efficient as possible.
Thanks. I want to make sure I'm giving people equal time, and if I'm doing a good job keeping track, I would kick it back to Diane. Do you have anything you want to pick up on from there? One potential direction, although you don't have to go this way, has to do with something I think you did touch on, with the issue of distributed energy resources and new technology. And I think one of the things that regulators and or legislators find of interest there is the potential for local economic benefits, and that can get to this issue of where are we going to try to put the rewards in the marketplace? And should it be that the utilities are given, for example, sort of first crack at earning from some of these new approaches or technologies, or should that be should others be given a chance to do that, because that might be a better local economic impact, for example? Is that something that you want to speak to, or is there something else that you've heard said that you'd rather tackle? I'll leave it up to you.
No, I think you raised what actually is a fascinating issue, which doesn't have a solution, and I think will get even more complicated, because we see dozens, if not even hundreds, I don't count it, of local governments now enacting climate action plans, all of which include some aggressive goals on energy efficiency. And in a number of states, though not all, local governments are able to enact what are called REACH codes, which are more stringent building codes than their state building commission does. And so we're going to see, I think, even more of a tension in terms of cities who want to do more in the energy efficiency side than may be going on at the utility level or the state level, and how you parse that out. If a utility is running a program throughout its service area, but there's 2 or 3 cities within that service area that are being are setting even stronger goals, will they have access to any utility customer money that their residents are paying or businesses are paying to design specially tailored programs that they can help implement? I personally think it is worth seeing how that can go, but you also have to be extremely careful of thinking about the measurement and verification on that side. And in my mind, not just giving an okay, take this money and spend it, because you can have some, pretty strong repercussions if you don't know what's happening. And then being able to track it, perhaps at the individual city level, as well as within a utility service area, is going to make all of our tools for tracking efficiency savings even more important. So I think it's actually a very interesting area, one that can bring in a lot of innovation and maybe some change, but there is still a role probably for state commissions and utilities to think about how they're going to play in that. I'll end with, in this area, there's the whole issue of utility data, which I hear so much from private companies in the efficiency space that says, if we could just get access to that data, we could really target programs, we could target efforts, we could really deliver some of these new online marketplaces, et cetera. And that, again, is an area that many of us have been involved with for years, of how do you balance customer privacy with having access to data so that you can get some innovation. There's not an easy answer, but I think looking forward, that's something where we all need to give more focus.
Thanks, Diane. To me, some of the conversation here, points to this ability. We talk about how utilities use ratepayer dollars for efficiency, or how regulators or legislators want those directed. Thinking about things from a market perspective, are there things that regulators can be looking for to leverage the ratepayer spending with other sources of information? And maybe this is too much of a return to this idea of, maybe ESCO is bringing in their dollars, but, there's topics like securitization of investments. Any panelists have anything to think about in terms of that, the concept of bringing in the private sector dollars and leveraging the other investments? And if so, particularly from the regulator perspective, what are the key issues there, or where are the resources that regulators can turn to help them understand those strategies?
I'll just say something quick, and then I want to make sure I give time for everybody else. This is where I'll get back to the idea that I had said it before about having once a year an innovation workshop. Another really important area is that you have this type of discussion, in my mind, outside of an adjudicatory utility battlefield on EE programs, that you bring in the people within your state who are able to offer private financing programs, or people who have some knowledge of where are other sources of money, because often it's other areas of the state even, and have that discussion broadly so that policymakers can see where the pots of money are, What can you leave alone and you don't need to address with utility programs, but maybe where you want to combine them with some utility efforts. So that's one area I encourage, this sort of collaborative exploration and education. I think commissions can play a valuable role.
Thanks, Diane. Anybody want to follow up on that?
Yeah, Maggie, absolutely agree that it's critical to leverage ratepayer dollars wisely. And I mentioned financing strategies earlier. You know, there are a number of things, whether that's bill, PACE, mentioned ESCOs earlier, green bank, some states, a handful now, and some local jurisdictions. And Diane mentioned a lot of the interest at the local level we're seeing around the country on clean energy. I think there's some good examples of green banks at the local level as well. So it's really important to leverage those. Don't want to be a give a sales pitch here, but we are doing our annual finance forum where we dig into these questions around leveraging private capital, and that's going to be in June in 2020. We do get, you know, kind of utility regulatory perspective from the examples that's on bill and some other utility programs, but also a broader financier perspective on energy efficiency in building sector, but also a little bit of transportation and industry as well.
Thank you, and it's okay to pitch the conference.
Okay.
Thanks. That's a small favor we can return for the time you've spent here. So we're getting down to the end of our time. I think I want to ask for a quick lightning round of summary. Try to take 90 seconds to give us some of your final thoughts, and I would pose one possible question to answer, which was suggested by my colleague, Tom Stanton, who's been helping out behind the scenes. I want to make sure he gets thanked here publicly. Tom, thanks for your help behind the scenes, helping me today. He thought that, maybe an interesting question would be, is there going to be a time when we can sort of say, you know what, we've done all we can on energy efficiency from the utility delivered and ratepayer funded perspective, and if so, how would we know that we've gotten there, and that perhaps it's time to turn regulatory attention to other issues of interest in our energy policy? So if you think you have something to share about that, please do. I'm going to go backwards, Jennifer, so that puts you on the spot first, I'm afraid.
Well, I think we've been kind of struggling with that notion. I think the policymakers, they were concerned about the amount of expenditures that the dollars we were spending on energy efficiency, and wondering why haven't we solved the problem? Why is it necessary to keep spending? And that's understandable. I think that as long as technology continues to change, that there will be some opportunity, and so Iowa may provide a good case study for what role the programs have in generating and influencing energy efficiency, because we're going from the last plan where we were, more roughly targeting all cost-effective energy, and I think we've greatly scaled that back now, and I think you'll get a chance to look at, what impact the programs are having and what impact happens without, a higher level of funding. So I think also just being careful to make sure you're watching technology evolve and have your programs be nimble enough to adjust the incentives and the eligibility as the market does transform, and that I think just make sure that you're spending the dollars wisely.
Thanks, Jennifer. And so what I heard is I heard you offering Iowa as a case study. So those of you out there who may be looking for a research project, you've been given an offer to investigate some on-the-ground data and a natural experiment of sorts. Ken, your thoughts on this issue of how do we know when enough is enough? I mean, I think you started with that as a question. Anything you want to sort of conclude from the conversation so far today?
Well, I guess my position is maybe it is time to think about retrenching on these programs. I know some states are doing that. In conducting some research for this webinar, other than sort of Iowa, there's a number of other states are seriously thinking about, sort of having the utilities sort of getting out of the energy efficiency business. I think sort of the argument, again, is that, when you go back to the 80s or so, when energy efficiency sort of initiated, that there were sort of problems, imperfections and obstacles for customers to engage in energy efficiency. But sort of the question I have is, what makes that market, the energy market, differ from other markets where you also have imperfections, you also have, behavioral problems, and yet rarely in markets do we have outside intervention in trying to steer or affect a consumer's consumption of a particular good or service. So the question I sort of leave you with is, what makes energy, what makes the energy market, the end-use energy market, differ from these other markets where, definitely you could point out problems where customers aren't making the right decisions, either from their perspective or from society's perspective.
I think that's a great handoff to Diane as a former regulator. It is, as Ken asked the question, why is this different? Is it because we're in a regulated industry overall, and that it's not, a quote unquote free market for energy, so to speak, as it is for other goods? Is that part of it? And if so, what might that tell us going forward?
I'd say exactly. I've heard Ken's arguments one way or another for 40 years, and yet we are having more success with energy efficiency utility programs now than ever. So I'm not going to say there aren't going to be people who are going to say, wait a minute, why do we keep spending the money? Haven't we fixed the market? Well, it's because, again, it gets back to the basics. If we can have $1 of utility customer money invested in efficiency and avoid more expensive alternatives on the supply side, as regulators, we've got to say we're taking a serious look at it. So now is, in my mind, absolutely not the time to say, hey, this is frustrating, this is hard to do, we don't really understand why it's going on. Instead, double down. We've got a lot of potential left, we've got a lot of inefficient buildings left, and I'll end with climate is real. And there's not a study that's been done that hasn't said energy efficiency needs to scale up to avoid even worse ramifications and more expensive alternatives. And so I think utility commissioners have a vital role to play to say where we have that cost effectiveness, where we can bring a role on bringing in innovation and market transformation. How can we play that role really smartly? It really is a way to work with lots of other factors, but I'm going to be casting my vote in this informal discussion on now's the time to double down, not step back.
Thanks, Diane. That gives the final word to you, Maggie. We're just about out of time, so give us your quick summary.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I mean, this is an important question. I always go back to having good analysis and facts to inform those really important decisions. Agree with Diane that climate change is real, and efficiency, as we've seen, if you get ambitious, you can get half the way there to the aggressive long-term targets, and having utility sector efficiency is going to be pivotal. And just as an example, I've seen estimates that there's $70 billion of planned gas-fired generation. So if those are emissions that policymakers are looking to avoid, you have a cost-effective solution like efficiency and bundling that with other clean energy sources, that is a demand-side solution to meeting that policy need. I recognize not all states are in that type of policy environment, but increasingly that is a key policy driver among others, as we've talked about in this panel. But having really good analysis, and I know in integrated, vertically integrated markets, resource planning looks one way and it's different in others. But whatever that regulatory environment, going back to having good numbers on efficiency and other options is really important to inform decision making.
Thanks, Maggie, and thanks to all of the panelists today. I hope you found this conversation as interesting and important as I did. I've put up on the screen a few links, and I know you won't necessarily be able to capture them, but these are going to be on our website, and I think we will probably find a few others to post there based on the conversation. For example, NSPM I heard mentioned, and we're having some back channel conversations here among the panelists about some other documents that we will post for your use. I hope you in the audience will, if you get a chance to communicate with any of these panelists, thank them for their time, follow up with them on their areas of expertise, and can keep following NRRI for further discussion on energy efficiency. This is certainly something that we're going to keep in front of us and on our table to continue looking at in 2020. We may have a follow-on webinar where we get into some of these issues in more detail or extend them to some related ideas. With that, I will close. Thanks very much for your participation. Thanks for your questions. Have a great day.